Some discussions about methods, we really can't let go of them. When you think of whether we look at the world, we try to somewhat describe it, maybe measure it, and then make sense of it, versus we come up with clear hypotheses and we put it into a methodological framework that we compare. There are two competing approaches almost. And when you are in the world of statistics, two names that you stumble upon there is the name of Fisher and the name of Pearson. And don't be confused, because Pearson is a whole dynasty almost of statisticians. At least two names come up that are very important. But what is also relevant here is that Pearson, they had a more open view of how we should test things, how we get data, how sometimes it just happens to us, and how we can compare things. And there was, I would say, a certain vibe of inductiveness that was in the air. And when you take Pearson's son, he went deeper into hypothesis testing and actually unraveled some of the problems that we have with static hypothesis testing and how we could solve and overcome them, thereby developing or at least solutions towards such problems as type 1 and type 2 errors. So there was some deep thinking on how we should deal with proportions and problems of false positives, false negatives, but also true positives and true negatives. So these are things that are deeply relevant when you consider medical trials, when you consider agricultural experiments and so on. But they originate from Fisher. And Fisher thought we should design the world, we should design statistical experiments, and we should be very strict in how we try to put the world into different parts that we then compare. And that is, in a sense, a very deductive worldview. That is something that tries to put the world somewhat into categories. And that is a real struggle. That's a real difference that you have between the Pearsons and Fisher. And a deep hatred came out of this relationship. Something that is extremely important and that preoccupies statistics up until today, because the problems haven't been solved. Do we have a synthetic? Do we have a more constructed worldview? How do these two compete? And what are the statistic ramifications? So if you think statistics are a closed book, then think again. Because since almost a century, there's been an ongoing, almost raging debate that started in the 1930s, and some would even argue before, and where dogmatic thinking and ignoring of certain facts, and when it comes to this, and also mathematical arguments, has been really raging back and fro. So Fisher, he had many well-chosen examples, but his statistical arguments were weak. And then when you come to Pearson, some would argue it's a little bit more foundational when it comes to the mathematics, and obviously concerning his influence, he was deeply foundational in terms of statistics, but it was less applicable, and it's more a bit like all over the place. So, and that is the problem that you have there. You have two competing schools that have solidified into what we have to assume to be modern quantitative science. And they haven't solved each other yet. They haven't squared their differences. And new things come in. Bayesian revolution is happening and more stuff is around. So we need to urgently think, how do we want to test the world? How do we quantify it? And how do we see the limitations that are deeply ingrained in these worldviews?